What some Christians call burden is only unspent emotion. It rises quickly and sounds serious, but it never gets down into the kind of clarity that makes obedience unavoidable. It leaves people talking strongly but living vaguely. It gives them religious language without that spiritual traction. That is one of the easier ways human beings deceive themselves. As long as the burden stays broad and aimed at others, commitment stays untested. Personal obedience never gets named, it fogs, protects, and uh, distracts you. We have a name for that kind of thing in public life: virtue signaling. People learn how to sound morally alert without ever getting close enough to the issue to be rearranged by it. The posture looks clean, the language feels sharp, it's visible, and it costs almost nothing. It is public alignment without private surrender. The church can use that same thing with spiritual language. We can sound burdened by the lost and remain untouched by the cost of evangelism. We can speak seriously about discipleship while avoiding the inconvenience of actually apprenticing under Jesus and helping others do the same. We can speak with intensity about revival, brokenness, the next generation, the mission of the church, and still leave everything vague. Vague enough that nobody has to repent, nobody has to commit, and nobody has to let the shape of their life change. That is what makes Nehemiah chapter 2 so necessary. By the time we reach this chapter, Nehemiah is no longer operating in that first emotion. He's not reacting, he's not performing concern on his Instagram account. Something in him has settled before God, not cooled off, settled. The grief is still alive, but now it has edges. It survived the silence and the long stretch without nothing visible happening. Nehemiah grieved before God in prayer and solitude and fasting. That is how we know this is real. There's no selfies on Nehemiah's Instagram with a coffee shop right in the background, Bible open, pastry of some kind nearby captioned "A Quiet Moment." No such thing. A burden from God does not merely intensify words. It starts pressing. It starts pressing your life towards obedience. It begins to demand shape. It pushes past that point of emotional concern and starts asking what faithfulness will be required now. That is where many people pull back at that moment. They prefer the burden while it was still poetic and virtuous and inspirational. Nehemiah doesn't pull back. And that is why this chapter matters to us. We are moving through grief and prayer towards the place where concern either becomes obedience to God or reveals itself as religious theater. Let me show you the text. It's Nehemiah chapter 2. Nehemiah chapter 2, I'm going to start with verse 1. In the month of Nisan, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, when wine was brought for him, I took the wine and gave it to the king. I had not been sad in his presence before, so the king asked me, "Why does your face look so sad when you are not ill? This can be nothing but sadness of the heart." I was very much afraid. But I said to the king, "May the king live forever. Why should my face not look sad when the city where my ancestors are buried lies in ruin, and its gates have been destroyed by fire?" The king said to me, "What is it you want?" Then I prayed to the God of heaven, and I answered the king, "If it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor in his sight, let him send me to the city of Judah where my ancestors are buried, so that I can rebuild it." The king, with the queen sitting beside him, asked me, "How long will your journey take, and when will you get back?" It pleased the king to send me, so I set a time. I also said to him, if it pleases the king, may I have letters to the governors of Trans-Euphrates, so that they will provide me safe conduct until I arrive in Judah. And may I have a letter to Asaph, keeper of the royal park, so that he will give me timber to make beams for the gates of the citadel by the temple, and for the city wall, and for the residence I will occupy. And because the gracious hand of my God was on me, the king granted my requests. So I went to the governors of Trans-Euphrates and gave them the king's letters. The king had also sent army officers and cavalry with me. When Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite official, her official, let me try that again. It's the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite official, heard about this, they were very much disturbed that someone had come to promote the welfare of the Israelites. I went to Jerusalem, and after staying there 3 days, I set out during the night with a few others. I had not told anyone what my God had put in my heart to do for Jerusalem. There was no mount with me except the one I was riding on. By night, I went out through the valley gate towards the Jackal Well and the Dung Gate, examining the walls of Jerusalem, which had been broken down, and its gates, which had been destroyed by fire. Then I moved on towards the Fountain Gate and the King's Pool, but there was not enough room for my mount to get through. So I went up the valley by night, examining the wall. Finally, I turned back and re entered through the valley gate. The officials did not know where I had gone or what I was doing, because as yet I had said nothing to the Jews or the priests or nobles or officials or any others who would be doing the work. Then I said to them, you see the trouble we are in. Jerusalem lies in ruins, and its gates have been burned with fire. Come, let us rebuild the wall of Jerusalem, and we will no longer be in disgrace. I also told them about the gracious hand of my God on me and what the king has said to me. They replied, let us start rebuilding. So they began this good work. But when Sanballat the Horonite, Tobiah the Ammonite official, and Geshem the Arab heard about it, they mocked and ridiculed us. What is this you're doing? They asked. Are you rebelling against the king? I answered them by saying, the God of heaven will give us success. We, his servants, will start rebuilding. But as for you, you have no share in Jerusalem or any claim or historic right to it. Okay, this text is a little bit long, but it's not loose. Everything in the text is pushing towards something important. The burden here is being tested. This man, Nehemiah, is being exposed. The city is finally being paced and faced honestly. So I do not want us to break this text apart in some disconnected observations. I actually want to follow the pressure that the chapter moves towards. So here's the three movements I like to cover. A burden waited, the door opened, and then the rubble. The rubble spoke. And this first movement is absolutely pivotal for everything that follows afterwards. So let's look at it. The burden waited. The chapter does not open with movement or with action, it opens with time. In the month of Nisan. That line is very easy to glide past, but it does provide theological insight. Chapter 1 opened the month of Kislev. That's roughly November and December. Now it's Nisan. It's around March and April. So real time has passed, months. The burden did not flash hot and then vanish. It remained. It stayed with Nehemiah long enough to survive this first wave of feeling. And that matters because weak burdens often lives off immediacy. It depends on heat. Once the room cools down, it disappears. What comes from God can endure the silence. And this is where Nehemiah is standing right now. The grief has stayed, but it has changed. It still hurts, but it's no longer ruling him. Prayer has steadied him. What began as ache is now moving towards obedience. And this is one of the first applications we need to hear in this chapter. Some things sound urgent simply because they are emotionally fresh. That is not the same as being weighty. There's a kind of intensity people can generate in a moment that feels alive, spiritual, but it has no endurance in it. They can speak quickly and cry honestly and still vanish the moment it is asked for something more costly. The feeling was real, but the roots were not. Nehemiah has roots. You can tell because later in the passage, when the king asks what he wants, Nehemiah is ready to answer. His presence with God enabled him to think through what obedience will require once the door opens. That is a needed correction for the church because we often mistake noise for life. We are easily fooled by volume, by immediacy, by performance, this emotional force. None of those prove spiritual weight. Some things burn hot only because they are shallow. They have not yet endured delay. They have not yet survived the stretch where nobody's asking about them, rewarding them, or helping carry them. Nehemiah's burden survives all that, which means by the time the king finally notices him, Nehemiah is prepared. Not polished, prepared. There's a difference. And that is what makes this first movement so important. If you miss the waiting, you will misread the rest of the chapter. You'll think the story is about a man having a courageous moment in front of a king. It's so much more than that. It's a story about how God does in a servant and what happens to him before the public moment ever arrives. So let me press on just a little bit here. What have you called burden that was only intensity? What have you carried just long enough to sound serious, but not long enough to let it reorder your life? Because when a burden really comes from God, it does not merely stir the emotions, it begins to shape the person carrying it. What had been carried privately for months now had to survive scrutiny and pressure and the dangerous simplicity of one question: what is it you want? The burden waited. And because it waited, when the door finally opened, Nehemiah was ready. And the door did open. So let's talk about that. The door opened. Nehemiah is standing in one of the most controlled rooms in the world. This is not a casual setting over a friendly conversation between equals. This is a Persian court. Rank is observed. Access is fully controlled. Mood and protocol are choreographed. The room is structured by power. And Nehemiah is trusted, yes, but trust is not the same thing as safety. He is near power, and yet he's under that power. Persian court life was shaped by surveillance, decorum, a real political danger. In a room like that, anything that is out of the ordinary does not go unnoticed. So the text says, I had not been set in the presence of the king before. That line tells you that Nehemiah knows exactly what just happened. Something private has become visible. That burden that he has carried for months has crossed his expression. And once the king sees it, the moment changes. The king is not just making conversation. He's actually pressing onto something that is irregular, something that is not quite as it ought to be. And verse 2, it says, why does your face look so sad when you're not ill? This can be nothing but sadness of heart. I don't hear this question as sounding casual. It sounds investigative. We cannot prove that the king is suspecting a plot or anything like that in that exact moment, but it is historically reasonable to hear more than warmth in his question. Kings in that world did not rule in an atmosphere of softness. Palace intrigue, violence, succession, assassinations were all part of the world around that throne. So when the king sees something that does not normally see in one of his men closest to him, it makes sense that he would press into it. He's not asking Nehemiah, hey, how's your week been? He's noticing something that does not fit the room. And Nehemiah knows immediately. I was very much afraid, he writes. Of course he was. Of course he was. That fear is situational awareness. Nehemiah understands the danger of the room. What he carried before God in secret has to now survive public exposure, has to survive that power and the consequences. When Nehemiah addresses the king, he answers with wisdom. He's not timid, but he's careful. He's careful. He knows that in the heat of the moment, it's easy for truth to be spoken recklessly. Notice how he begins. He begins with respect. May the king live forever. Then he names the grief. He speaks of the city where his ancestors are buried. He speaks of ruin and the gates destroyed by fire. He's not manipulating. He's not speaking half truths. He's telling it in a way that fits the room and honors the moment. Then the king asks the sentence that reveals whether Nehemiah has only burden in his heart or also if he has clarity about the situation. The king asks, what is it you want? And then we read one of the quietest lines in verse 4, and it tells you the deepest truths about Nehemiah. It says, then I prayed to the God of heaven. In the middle of that tension, he understands there's a spiritual battle. He's in the Persian Empire throne room, and yet he appeals to God of heaven, the higher throne room. He does not need the right conditions to feel spiritual. He prays right there inside the pressure. A lot of people today sound spiritual when the mood is right, but pressure reveals the heart. A life of prayer has cultivated an instinctive lifestyle of prayer. What is it you want? That question exposes people. See, there are Christians who speak intensely about what grieves them. Far fewer are ready when the door opens to say plainly what obedience would now require because they have appealed to the God of heaven. Nehemiah is ready. He asks to be sent to Judah. Here's a man who has thought through what faithfulness will look like in his specific circumstances. He understands the practicalities of the world he is being sent into. Persian rule moved through governors, letters, permission, controlled resources, roads, escorts, recognized authority. So Nehemiah's requests are not excessive, they're sober, they're appropriate. He asks for passage, letters, materials, and time because he understands what this will be required of him in the world that he actually inhabits. Governors can obstruct. Word of mouth is not enough, so he needs letters to the governors of Trans-Euphrates. Walls do not rise on sincerity. This is not theater. It's an assignment. So he asks for a letter to Asaph. This is the keeper of the royal park, the materials contractor, if you will. So the timber can be released for the gates, the wall, and the residence he will occupy. That kind of clarity, and this is important because that kind of clarity is not less spiritual than the tears he shed 6 months earlier. It is what happens when tears have done their work. Nehemiah is living by faith, but he's also acknowledging that obedience to God will often move through the existing structures that exist around him. And once again, the church needs that kind of correction. Faith filled prayer and faithful planning are not in competition. Careful thought does not mean inferior faith. Nehemiah's practical requests are not the opposite of spirituality. In the kingdom of God, spiritual life takes visible form. And then the text in verse 8 guards the whole scene from becoming a lesson in elitism or elite composure because it says, the gracious hand of my God was on me. Because of that, the king grant me requests. Nehemiah doesn't tell the story as if the breakthrough came because he mastered the room. He does not give us a method for how gifted people leverage power. He tells us that God was active there. The same God he sought in grief is the God moving inside the palace. The same God who heard chapter 1 is already at work in chapter 2. I am so grateful for that line in verse 8 because otherwise people will hear a text like this and think the point is becoming more strategic or more polished, more persuasive. But the deeper truth here is that Nehemiah's readiness and God's hand are not competing explanations, they belong together. God formed that man in the secret of prayer. Then God opened the door in public. And then the text adds one more detail that makes the whole scene, I don't know, heavier, I guess. The king sent army officers, not one, army officers and cavalry with him. So Nehemiah does not leave the palace as a private believer on a private concern. He leaves with visible backing, recognized authority, written documentation, and this royal escort. The mission now has public weight. It can be seen, it can be tracked, and it can be resisted. Well, which is exactly what happens when Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite official heard about this. They were very much disturbed that someone had come to promote the welfare of the Israelites. That is such a revealing line. They are disturbed, understatement, right? They are disturbed by the arrival of a man seeking the good of God's people. The wall is still in ruins. No action has yet been taken, yet Nehemiah's presence is enough to trouble them. That tells you something about opposition. When the church begins to move with unusual clarity, it will be noticed. It will be noticed by authority, by the curious, and by those who feel threatened. That does not mean that the church should become paranoid or fearful. It does mean it should stop being naive. A living church cannot move from vague concern to visible obedience without the room changing around it. My friends, this is part of the reason why we are studying Nehemiah. The door opened, yes, absolutely it opened, but it was not into ease. It opened into scrutiny and risk. The kind of moment where prayer had to hold and clarity had to speak. And through it all, the hand of God had to carry what Nehemiah could not. He could not control things. Yet, this is God's mission, not Nehemiah's. And that is where the application here gets uncomfortably close to us. Some of us have been asking God for open doors while also staying unprepared for what an open door would expose. An open door will not merely affirm, it will test. It will test you and me. Open doors for the gospel will reveal whether the burden in you and me has matured enough to speak plainly. It will reveal whether prayer has become a reflex or still remains dependent on the right mood. It will reveal whether you actually know what obedience requires or whether you only know how to sound burdened and bothered. Church, are you ready? Are you ready? If God opened the door in front of you, would you be ready to answer the question that matters? What is it you want? At this point in our text, Nehemiah has permission, he's got papers, protection, and a path in front of him. He knows what he needs to do. Royal favor is one thing, but the rubble, well, that's another. God had opened the door. Now God lets the ruins, the, the, the rubble speak for themselves. The rubble spoke. Nehemiah leaves the palace. And after weeks of travel, he arrives safely in Jerusalem, waits 3 more days, and still says nothing. He has carried this burden now for more than 6 months. He's got the authority. The materials have been approved, but he still says nothing. There's something missing. Well, what is that? Nehemiah does not yet have first-hand sight on the ruins. And Nehemiah is not arrogant enough to confuse authorization with understanding. He knows a door can be open before the full truth is visible. So he knows a man can be sincere and still not know what he is standing in front of. So he goes to look at night in secret. He tells no one yet what God has put in his heart. Well, maybe our application is the following, that some people speak too eagerly and too early because they enjoy that feeling of carrying important things. They want the weight to be visible because it nourishes them, but it's not quite ready to be useful. Nehemiah has no interest in that. He's not trying to look burdened. He's trying to understand what this burden actually is asking of him. So he investigates. He goes by the valley gate, the jackal wall, the dung gate, fountain gate, king's pool. This is slow. This is physical, obstructed work. He's not glancing at the problem from top. He's entering it. He's going into it. He's letting the city affect him physically. And then the text gives you the detail that tells the truth about the whole scene. There was not enough room for his mount to get through. Too much garbage. The rubble stopped him. Now, just as the report in chapter 1 made him sit down, the rubble in chapter 2 makes him slow down. And that is what real damage does. It interrupts movement. It resists clean speeches and tidy solutions. No, I'm not talking about drama or victimhood. It's the reality of a broken down wall and a national crisis with no easy solutions. And Nehemiah does not turn away from it, which actually takes a different kind of courage. And I think we need that kind of courage now, to see the problem and not turn away from it. Spiritual drift is not just hard season. Chronic shallowness is not everybody's being busy. Spiritual confusion is not simply where people are. At some point, we lose the right to keep putting kind language over ruins that have been speaking for years. Some churches never reject the truth openly. They just learned to live around it. They organized their life around the damage. And some even call it stability. It is not stability, it is adaptation to the ruins. And Nehemiah refuses that adaptation. He does not tell the city a better story than it deserves. He walks the ruins until the ruins have said enough. He gathers the truth so that he can share it at the right time and in the right way. That's important because some people tell the truth too early and weaken the work by their own immaturity. They throw weight into the room before they have the strength to carry it. Nehemiah does not do that. He holds the matter until the truth is clear enough to serve the people instead of merely alarming them. His silence is not lack of courage or hiding, it's protected discernment. Protected discern because Sanballat and Tobiah all are already watching. And Nehemiah refuses to expose the work before he understands the work. But when he finally speaks in verse 17, the sentence carries weight because it comes after the inspection. You see the trouble that we are in. We see the trouble that you see the trouble that we are in. Did you notice the pronoun? The pronoun? Not you, we. He has entered the burden deeply enough to speak from inside it. He does not arrive as a critic. He does not stand over the people with analysis. He stands among them with the truth. And then he makes the call. Come, let us rebuild. That's the turn. That's the turn. The burden that waited, the door that opened, the rubble that spoke. Now the people are called. Let us rebuild. And there's an application here for us. The church cannot move into a new chapter of ministry while most people remain adjacent to the work and a faithful few absorb the cost. It cannot keep talking about formation, renewal, discipleship, care, belonging, community while remaining passive observers. So I'm asking you, come, let us rebuild. That is where burden becomes shared mission. And people's answer in verse 18 can sound, I guess, anticlimactic to us. They just say, let us start rebuilding. It's the right answer. It's practical, straight and to the point. But the moment they begin, the resistance sharpens. Look at verse 19. Earlier, there were 2 names. Now there are 3 names. Sanballat, Tobiah, Geshem. See, the network of resistance is gaining momentum. My friends, do not expect opposition to shrink as the work of the kingdom becomes clearer. Expect it to be more visible, more connected, more coordinated. Nehemiah's antagonists mock, they ridicule, they try to rename the work. Are you rebelling against the king? And this is important. This is critical. This is how opposition often works. It does not only resist the work, it tries to rename it, to reshape it, to reinterpret it. It takes something clean and frames it as dangerous. It takes something faithful and recasts it as threatening. It wants the people of God defending themselves before they even begin to build. Nehemiah will not surrender the meaning of the work to the mockers. His answer in verse 20 is strong because it is not cluttered. He names God as the one who will bring success. He is clear about who God's servants are, and he names the work to be done. And he puts a boundary in place based on God's promises. You have no share in Jerusalem or any claim or historic right to it. I guess Nehemiah knows his scriptures. He knows the biblical text and stands on it. Okay, so here's where the chapter leaves us, the burden. The burden waited. The door that was closed, now it's open. The rubble that was not seen now spoke. And then Nehemiah said, "Come, let us rebuild." He ends with shared obedience. And that is exactly where we are right now. We have a report also. We received it not from Hanani like Nehemiah did, but from our own community assessment. And the report is not vague. Loneliness and isolation is real. Caregiver strain is real. Spiritual confusion is real. Church engagement decline is real. Disconnection from purpose is real. The community assessment report that we have does not just name these cultural pressures, it also names a path forward for us through apprenticeship, belonging, care, well being, agile teams with shared missions. So the question now is not whether the needs are real. The question is whether we will keep admiring the report and the needs or whether we will rise under it. If you're still on the edge, then take your next step in the pathway. What does that look like? Well, explore, belong, grow, minister, multiply. Every ministry at Agape is meant to be a ramp up into that pathway, because the goal is not simply to know more about Jesus. It's apprenticing to Jesus, which means to live like him in this real world. If you're in but remain distant, choose belonging over religious detachment. Sit at the table. Get known. Let people into your life. This is critical to our path forward. A real ministry need in our community is relational depth. And our calling, part of the rebuilding, includes making space for people to feel known before they believe or they serve. If you're in the church, move from admiration to shared mission. Don't leave the work to a faithful few. Carry your part of the wall. One of the gaps we are facing is team building. Not only volunteer gaps that we have, but we need to learn to participate together in an agile team. That is why shared mission matters so much in this season. And for some of you, the next step is not platform ministry, it's practical care. Practical care. It's presence. First, it's showing up faithfully and consistently. Then it's showing up for families in transition and for caregivers, for people who are isolated, for those who are spiritually confused, for those who are tired enough to disappear while nobody notices. That too is part of the wall. So, come, let us rebuild. This is not a call to frantic activity or a random church busyness. This is a call to specific obedience. God has not called us just to share in the burden, to stare at the rubble in the community. He called us to answer the report with obedience, to rebuild and draw people to the Lord Jesus through apprenticeship, through belonging, care, presence, and joyful teams on mission. So the question is really simple. Will we keep talking about the need, or will we rise and rebuild? My friends, come in, let us rebuild. God bless you. Amen.